Hello, and welcome to my home here in Corpus Christi, Texas. When I speak in classes or at book talks or at conferences, I'm often asked why I wrote From Thought to Action, Developing a Social Justice Orientation. And I think that's a fair question. You know, I'm not necessarily the first candidate you might think of when you think of somebody writing a social justice book like this one. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to address the why today. When I first wrote the book, I was an assistant professor many years ago at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, which is my alma mater and where I started my faculty career after a short time at the University of Iowa, which is where I received my PhD. And if you've read the book, you learned in chapter 1 that my 3 years in Iowa were pivotal to my social justice journey. It was a turning point for me, a major turning point, some things that happened there. As a result of that turning point, when I came back to Tahlequah as a faculty member in 2004, I was a really different person than when I had left 3 years earlier. And I felt this deep sense of responsibility to my students to make sure that they were introduced to concepts of social justice in those few short years, I would get with them at the university. Most of the students at Northeastern State at that time, and probably still today, were white, with perhaps some Cherokee influences in their DNA, and sometimes culturally as well. On average, they were working class, first generation college students, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, and non-Catholic Christians with very little exposure to anyone with a lived experience different than their own. And I've got to tell you, they were me, and I was them just a few years earlier when I started college at the same university. These students had capacity for social empathy. I knew this about them. Even with their limited experiences, I knew they had capacity for social empathy. I had seen it growing up in a community very near Tahlequah, and I saw it in how people took care of each other. Even with me, there were some older folks in the community who I was not related to, but I went to church with them, and they kept a savings account for me at the local bank so that I could compete in speech contest in high school. I used the account to buy clothing, pay entry fees, pay travel expenses, those sorts of things. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to compete because my family couldn't have afforded for me to do it. So I knew people were nice to their own, but I wanted to test and expand my students' level of comfort and exposure with the other, capital O, other. I didn't have all the formal language or jargon back then as a new professor, but I took what I learned in Iowa and I started self-educating on marginalized communities of which I wasn't a member, and then started presenting that information in my lectures. And at that time, I taught classes, like public speaking and business and professional communication and group communication. And with time, I was allowed to teach special seminar topics. And then I would talk about these things more informally when I traveled with my students to conferences and to speech and debate tournaments, because I was the coach of that team back then. And then when I would attend university events, which I would do often, I would kind of have informal conversations about these topics as well. I had a deep sense of urgency and obligation to those students. I wanted them to reach their full potentials and to influence their families and communities in very positive ways. I had personally discovered how freeing it was to embrace a larger existence and humanity, and I wanted that for them too. And just as an aside, I'll tell you, I'm very close to many of those students from way back then. And they're incredible. They're lawyers and educators and salespeople and trainers and parents and PR professionals and journalists and clergy. And some of them did move back to their family land and their hometowns. And some others have gone other places, to other communities, and sometimes to bigger cities. And I'm really proud of the personal professional decisions they've made. They are good people, and they are unapologetic about how they feel about social justice, and they are anti-racist. And they do these things even though it makes some of their families and people back home angry. they take action. I see them. They attend protests. They encourage boycotts and boycotts. They host podcasts. And many of them are also influencing young children in their families as well, which I think is one of the most important things anybody can do. You will find these forever students in the book's dedication. And I often say to people that if the only people who read the book were my forever students, I would be okay with that. And because more than anything, and this was the reason I wrote the book, I owed it to them. Because there was a time back then, 15 years ago or so, when I was in my 20s and first teaching all these concepts, and I watched their evolutions, of which I was just few steps ahead of them. I saw their struggles and their anger with the material, and sometimes I was powerless to do anything about it. There's no one knowing something. You really take a responsibility as an educator when you choose to raise consciousness. And, once our students know about oppression, there's no one hearing it. And they can deny it, and some of them will, but they can't forget it. Once you see and hear 5-year-old Jazz Jennings explaining to Barbara Walters what it's like to be born into a boy body, but know you're a girl, there's no forgetting her. And that was a video I showed way back then that still, I think, influences me and others. My students, when I first started teaching these concepts, really started to struggle with watching TV and films for pleasure, as did I. They told me that they noticed the lack of representation of certain folks and the misrepresentation of others. They looked for people to blame for not pointing out this information sooner, including their K-12 teachers, their parents, and their preachers. They also struggled with relationships with family members who believed they were undergoing liberal brainwashing and getting too far from their family's Christian values. There were some that were a little further along on the journey, and they wanted to take action against wrong, but they didn't know how to do it, and they were afraid of things like being arrested, losing their jobs, and conflicts with people who disagree with them. My students looked to me to help them with all the questions they had about these things. And for many of them, I was the first person like me they'd ever encountered. Somebody who was from the area, shared a lot of their characteristics, but also cared deeply about social justice in marginalized communities. I would often just sit and talk with them and suggest readings or documentaries, some that I had just read or watched myself, but I couldn't point to just one book or one movie. And the more years I taught and the more responsibility I took with the university, and as I went up for tenure, I had less time to individually counsel students. And plus, I just had too many students and former students. So I started outlining the book I felt like my students wanted and needed, and that is From Thought to Action, Developing a Social Justice Orientation. It took me 5 years to write the book. If you've read the book, you know that the first half includes my journey, and that first chapter was difficult to write. It was humbling and made me feel very vulnerable. I talk about pivotal turning points in my own life. I talk about histories of social justice movements in that first half of the book, language used in social justice, and turning points in the lives of activists. And because I hope that would inspire readers to want to do similar things, to move into action, right? The second half of the book starts to really get into actions of social justice and picking a topic or a cause that really fits your own personal mission. Dialoguing with people with whom you may disagree, because it's often what my students experienced in their own families. And then leadership and collaborating as you move along in a movement, and the risk and rewards of being a social justice activist. For communication scholars like me and my students, the second part of the book probably feels the most familiar because it includes the most communication concepts. So there you have it. There is your 10-minute answer about why I wrote the book. It was for my students and for the debt I had to pay them and for future students who are going to come along and have similar questions. If you are one of my forever students, I can never thank you enough for what you've done for my life. You have always made me want to work harder and be better. So that's the story of the book. And for anyone who's watching, if you have other questions about the book or about my journey or about your journey, please always feel free to reach out to me. I'm easy to find on social media, but you can also find me at my current university and shoot me an email. I look forward to hearing from you all.